I'm a little bit louder. I didn't realize I can do that. I used my diaphragm that time. And we remember Palm Sunday and Jesus riding on a donkey into Jerusalem. I want to give us just a little bit of pause because I want to link Palm Sunday with where we're headed in today's message with Elisha. Imagine being Jesus, knowing what's going to happen at the end of the week. And you're riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, preparing the way. What's on your mind? What are you thinking about? What do you know is happening? What are the people crying out with palm branches waving and laying their cloaks and palms on the ground as you ride in? What are the people's hearts saying about you? And there's Jesus, seeing people gather, shouting, Hosanna. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Knowing that you have to die that week for them. Today we're going to look at two stories where Elisha is going to, do what Elisha does. But the stories aren't so much about Elisha as they are about two ladies in two different circumstances. And I think as we read the text of Scripture here shortly about these stories, I want you to start asking all the why questions you can. I titled my message today, Why? Why did I? It's because I want you to ask those questions. Whenever you sit down and read a scripture passage or any text, you ask all the questions that you can. Today I want you to ask all the why questions. Today's stories are not about kings and queens. They're not about armies. They are not about Baal worship or fire coming from heaven, and they're not about false prophets. Today's stories are about people. Average, everyday people who find themselves in situations beyond their control. They find themselves in trouble because life is not fair. Since Genesis chapter 3, we have seen people turn evil, wicked, ruthless, and lawless. However, we also see that the world is not operating the way that it was designed to, because sin has entered into it. The earth does not produce its crops like it was designed. The health of individuals deteriorates. Health or death is everywhere. People struggle to live life, to make ends meet, to even start a family if they choose to, and know that life is so unpredictable that tragedies can come at any time. Now, we as people, psychologically, cannot continue to live in a perpetual state of fear. We can't fear life and the circumstances around us forever and ongoing because it causes us to change. According to a little research I did online, and it doesn't take long to find it, you're going to see that fear does a few things to us. In our physical health, fear weakens our immune system and can cause cardiovascular damage, gastrointestinal problems such as ulcers and irritable bowel syndrome, decreased fertility, and it can lead to accelerated aging and even premature death. Fear can affect your memory. It can impair formation of long-term memories and cause damage to certain parts of the brain, such as the hippocampus. This can make it even more difficult to regulate fear and can leave a person anxious most of the time. To someone in chronic fear, the world looks scary, and their memories confirm that. Fear can also affect your brain processing and reactivity. Fear can interrupt processes in our brains that allow us to regulate emotions, read nonverbal cues and other information presented to us, reflect before acting, and act ethically. This impacts our thinking and decision-making in negative ways, leaving us susceptible to intense emotions and impulsive reactions. All of these effects can leave us unable to act appropriately. And last, fear can affect your mental health. Other consequences of long-term fear include fatigue, clinical depression, and PTSD. So whether you're thinking about Jesus riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, knowing what's going to happen that week, or whether you're going to be one of the people in the stories that I'm going to read about here in a moment, we're going to find that fear can be all around you. And you might be indulging in it at any moment because you don't know what is going to happen. We can see quickly that since life can be unfair, that fear can quickly take over our lives. And in these stories, Elisha the prophet is going to play a role in it, but he's going to teach us something about God. That God is the true King of Israel. And he responds appropriately to the unfair circumstances and lives of his people. But he doesn't do it the same for everyone. Why? Allow me to read the stories. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 37. This might take me a few breaths to get through. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a small jar of olive oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. And they brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. And when all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." And then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." And one day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there, who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. And she said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." And one day when Elisha came, he went up to his room and lay down there. And he said to his servant Gehazi, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and she stood before him. And Elisha said to him, "Tell her, you could have gone to all this trouble for us. You have gone to all this trouble for us." I'm having trouble reading today. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" And she replied, "I have a home among my own people." "What can be done for her?" Elisha asked. Gehazi said, "She has no son, and her husband is old." Then Elisha said, "Call her." So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. And about this time next year, Elisha said, "You will hold a son in your arms." "No, my lord," she objected. "Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. The child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers, and he said to his father, "My head, my head." His father told a servant, "Carry him to his mother." After the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, then shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of your servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return." Why go to him today?" he asked. "It's not the new moon or the Sabbath." "That's all right," she said. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant, Gehazi, look, there's a Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? Everything is all right, she said. Then she reached the man of God at the mountain. She took hold of his feet, and Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone. She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why. Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes? And Elisha said to Gehazi, tuck your cloak into your belt, take my staff in your hand and run. Don't greet anyone you meet, and if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face. But the child's mother said, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So he got up and followed her. And Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him, the boy is not awakened. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself on him, the boy's body grew warm. And Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room. And then he got on the bed and stretched out on him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite. And he did. And when she came, he said, take your son. She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. Interesting stories, aren't they? People in the raw aspects of life, terrible circumstances, and how God has cared for them. Let's look at the first story. Point number 1 today is just about the first story, a slippery situation. As the story goes, a widow of a prophet has run out of money, and the creditors are coming to take her 2 sons away as servants until they pay off the debts. And so let's unpack this a little bit. First, the setting. Remember how Ahab and Jezebel were killing off the prophets of the Lord? It would have taken a great deal of time and sacrifice to continue the maintenance of the prophetic ministry. I mean, if you could imagine for a moment, it's not exactly a popular thing to be a prophet of the Lord in that day. If you reveal yourself, you're going to be hunted. So to do so would have taken great time and care and much sacrifice to continue on the preaching and the care of the ministry for Yahweh. Back in 1 Kings chapter 18, we remember the story of Obadiah. And he was serving King Ahab as the palace administrator. He was also hiding 2 groups of prophets, 50 in each of those groups, supplying them with food and water, even though the king was trying to kill them off. He was a double agent of sorts. The thought of a double agent reminds me of something. What do you call it when James Bond takes a bath? 007. The company of prophets were most likely helping each other out during this time. It had been difficult. I mean, they had to be able to earn a living somehow and also preach the word. And along with Elijah and Elisha, with the continued ministry to remind people to follow Yahweh, not the Baals, right? And so it would be a tough slog to do this type of ministry. Some of you might know a Roman Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. He theorized that this woman in this story was the wife of Obadiah. And there's no biblical support or evidence for the theory, but he liked to think that it was. And the point is that within these prophets, their families would have had to sacrifice a lot. And they quite possibly would have had to gone in debt to continue on this ministry, which is what happened here. This lady and her sons saw, her husband pass away. And he left some debt. And now her and her sons needed to pay it off. So she brought her problems to Elisha. He responded by asking 2 questions, and it's fascinating because the first question we can absolutely see. It's like, how can I help you? The second question makes him sound like a thief. Tell me, what do you have in your house? But he's trying to help, and it's probably a good thing to ask when people come to us. How can I help you? Don't ask them, what do you have in your house? That might sound a bit awkward, but how can I help you? Sometimes, and quite often, many times, when people come and share with you, they don't want you to solve their problems. They want you to listen. Sometimes they may ask for help, sometimes not. So Elisha listens. What's going on? And as we already know from the story, he had the lady get a whole bunch of jars from the neighbors and everything so that she can collect as much oil as possible. Sell the oil, pay off the debt, and live off of the rest of the income. And that's exactly what happened. Her family was rescued from a slippery situation. I don't know about you, but I think all of the essential oil enthusiasts in the room would love to know how to duplicate this miracle. Or perhaps the farmers among us would love to see this happen with their diesel holding tanks on the farm. But what we see is that God uses a prophet to show that God cares about his people. Not just the nations or kings and queens or armies, but the average everyday person is known and loved by God. On rare occasion, he offers miracles. But in all occasions, God walks with us and helps us through our trials. But it seems that fear can flourish. If you can imagine yourself in this story being this lady, or being one of the sons, how would you be feeling? What have you just gone through with your husband or with your father, with his loss, and now with his debt? And now with creditors coming to take away your children. Bad circumstances, or even the fear of bad circumstances, can create a toxic atmosphere in your life. You know, we long to get rid of our fears. We do whatever we can. We make whatever plans, whatever it takes to alleviate our concerns. And sometimes we will blame others for our circumstances and the fears that poison our hearts. Try imagining being this lady. Put yourself in her story. Feel what she was going through. And after you examine it well, notice the love of God. How he cares and how he helps. Let's move on to the next story about another lady and her situation. Point number 2 is, what a headache. In the first story, a lady needed assistance in her dire circumstances. In this next story, Elisha is asked at first to accept a lady's hospitality. In his travels, he would have passed by her place several times going to Mount Carmel. It was a common place for him to go. And as a God-fearing individual, she made a plan with her husband to create a room on top of their house where Elisha can just go up there and stay while he was on his journeys. So that's what he did. Elisha used it on his travels. We don't know how many times he had by this point, but on one of those trips, he asked his servant Gehazi to go and invite this lady to come and talk to him so that he can bless her. Gehazi asks her some questions, and she doesn't need any political favor and whatever. But because of her hospitality and the expenditures that her and her husband have gone through for him, he asked if he could speak on behalf of those in political authority, which is interesting because that shows that Elisha has some influence and importance in the nation at this point. Maybe it was because of the encounter he had and the help he gave during the battle that we studied last week. I don't know. But he has influence. He's well known. Now, she declines the offer and saying that they need no need for social or material assistance. No political assistance. They're well established. Which is very different than the lady in the first story. In contrast to the first woman in the first story, this one has no children. Just like the story of Sarah and Abraham, who found out that a miracle would take place, and And Elisha announces that she herself is going to have a son next year. The lady would have been flabbergasted and not even daring to hope that what he said would come to pass. But in a year's time, she had a son. Now, it says years later when the child had grown, so this story takes place over a long period of time. We don't know how old the son is, but old enough to be able to run and talk. Years later, as the child had grown, the fear of every parent happened. Something happened to the boy's head, and he died. We don't know what it was. And just like the woman in Zarephath who blamed Elijah a few chapters ago for her son's death, this lady blames Elisha for giving her hope and then taking her son away from her in tragedy. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah takes a boy, puts him on his bed, lays on top of the boy, and he returns to life. And well, here we see a duplication of the story. In this story, the woman saw her son die in her arms. And she placed her son on Elisha's bed and went to find the prophet. She's not giving up yet. Her husband, at this point, comes across as uncompassionate and questions the timing of her leaving with one of the servants because it was harvest time and all hands need to be on deck. And that's why he mentions, well, it's not a new moon or Sabbath, a time when they wouldn't be working, and that's when they would have normally gone to Mount Carmel. But in verse 23, as the NIV translate her response to her husband, she says, that's all right. Basically, she's going anyway. That word there is the word shalom, and it can mean a wide variety of different things. And it's kind of like, I'm going anyways. That's the end of it. Just one word. And she sets off to Mount Carmel, and Elisha sends Gehazi to ask her if everything is all right, and she responds with the exact same word. Everything's fine. And then Elisha saw her, and when she's coming up to him, because she wanted to see him personally, and she falls down, takes a hold of his feet, and he sees that she is not well. He did not know what had happened to her son. He received no word from the Lord that he died. And so we can see from reading the story that he wasn't to blame, but she blames him in verse 28. So Elisha sent Gehazi to the boy with his staff ahead as assurance that he is headed there right away, but she gives the exact same response to Elisha, that she's not leaving him. Do you remember when Elijah and Elisha were walking along in Jerusalem, or not in Jerusalem, but in Israel, and Elijah was about to be taken away, and they were headed south, and they're going to cross the Jordan River where Elijah would be taken in a whirlwind. In that story, 3 times Elijah told Elisha that he can leave if he wanted to, and 3 times he said the exact same words this lady says to him. She's not going anywhere without him. And so as Gehazi got there, put the staff on the boy, nothing happened, ran back as they were on their travels to see the boy. They all get there together. Elisha gets in the room there and locks everybody else out, and he lays on top of this boy. And the temperature starts rising. He gets up and he's pacing back and forth in the room. But nothing's happening. So he does it again. And he gets up, and it says that the boy sneezed 7 times. And the number 7, again, is used in a prophetic sense, a number that shows whatever happened to the boy, he has now been completely restored. There's complete restoration at this point. Interestingly enough, the word that's used for Elisha stretching out on the boy is the same word that was used about Elijah. When he was sitting on Mount Carmel, and after he had finished his encounter with the prophets of Baal, and the fire came down, and the prophets were all slain, and he started praying to the Lord for the rain to come. It's that same posture, that same word that's used here. And the boy sneezes 7 times, and then he calls everybody in. She bowed at the prophet's feet and took her son. 2 different stories, 2 different women, in 2 different circumstances, and we are left with one question. Why? Let me expand on this. Sure, the question can be asked in different ways. We can ask, why did God only provide oil for the first family instead of raising her husband back to life? Or why do good, God-fearing people who serve the Lord face hard times and dire circumstances like debt and the threat of creditors taking her sons away, leaving her destitute just to pay off the bills? In the second story, we can ask, why did God allow the boy to die in the first place, if only to raise him up again? Why was she unable to have children to begin with? And there's a million different types of why questions you can ask in the story. Why questions always look to the motive or the reason something happened or will happen. Why questions look to the heart of the person or the purpose of a situation to find meaning. We want things to make sense. We want to understand. So we ask why. And you know what? Often we don't get an answer. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes we have to search for the answer. But often we are left without a response or purpose for the situation. That's why I like Peter's story that he shared earlier on. God puts ingredients together and bakes us through the heat of life. Something else comes out at the end, but we can't see it. We don't know why. Sometimes God performs a miracle, and yet often He does not. And so we are left with wondering about the character of God and His motivation. You know, I believe it is completely fine to ask God why questions. Ask Him all the questions that you want. He is wise and strong and loving and completely understanding of what you're facing in life. Now, I can't promise that He will answer your questions or answer them the way that you want. But I know that He is able to lead you through the situations, to comfort you, and to care for you according to His purposes. Prayer is one of the best responses that we can have in life, no matter what we face. Are you joyful? Pray and give thanks. Are you working at something mundane? Pray and give thanks. Are you in pain and suffering? Pray and ask God for comfort and for help. Bring your concerns to God. The Scriptures teach us in 1 Peter chapter 5, cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. Fear can really have a huge impact in our lives. It can change us. And as I showed you earlier on in my message, it can have quite dire consequences if we live in perpetual fear. Now, I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. And as they do that, I want us to contemplate on today's application. With fear and its adverse effects that come in multiple ways, the Scriptures remind us about something and teach us something. It teaches us to trust in the Lord with all of our heart, to lean not on our own understanding. And in all of our ways, He will direct our paths. Trusting the Lord can change the way that you view the world. It'll change the way that you respond to the situations you find yourselves in. Trusting the Lord can develop a stronger and more intimate relationship with Him. Jesus on Palm Sunday needed to trust in His Father. Trust in the plan that God had set out from before the creation of the world. Him riding into Jerusalem was set in stone. Going to the cross and dying for creation, it was there. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, how difficult that time would have been. God cares for the widow. God cares about the children. God cares about your losses. God cares about your finances. God cares about you. And I would like us to respond to this text of Scripture and the promises of God through song and worshiping His holy name.